He lived alone for years until a stranger with a baby asked, "Can we stay one night?" Montana Plateau, winter, 1875. Snow buried the evergreens and swallowed the last light from the ridge. Eleanor Carter's cabin stood alone, a silhouette of stubborn timber carved into silence. 6 winters had passed since her husband died in the war and her daughter in the fever. Since then, Eleanor had built walls, not just of pine but of grief pressed into routine. She lived by the rhythm of survival, baking in the clay oven she'd built by hand, drying herbs, chopping wood. Words had grown rare in her house. So had guests. That night the fire hissed low in the hearth. She was tending it when a knock broke through the wind. Sharp, urgent. Eleanor paused, spatula midair. She waited, but the knock came again, harder this time. She moved with the steadiness of a woman who feared little but trusted less. Lantern in hand, she stepped to the door. Through the frost-glazed window, she saw a figure, snow-drenched and hunched, cradling something against his chest. She opened the door. The storm surged in with a roar. A man staggered forward, face pale, coat stiff with ice, his arms wrapped tightly around a bundle that whimpered softly. "My horse died 5 miles back," he said, voice rough. "My son and I walked here. He's freezing. Please, just one night." Eleanor's eyes dropped to the child, a boy, small and limp in the man's arms, breath fluttering in fragile puffs. Her lips pressed thin. "My stove's small," she said. "Floor's colder than out there." The man didn't plead. He just looked down, the way a tired mule lowers its head in storm. "We got nowhere else to go." She studied him. Not young, but not yet old. Rough hands. A good coat, frayed at the collar. He clutched the child with the kind of care that said he had lost things before and could not afford to lose again. Eleanor stepped aside. "Come in." He nodded once and crossed the threshold with the boy, lowering him near the fire, arms shaking, not from cold now, but something deeper. The child stirred, a tiny hand flailing against the air. Eleanor shut the door with a firm hand and turned away. No more words. She moved to the oven, stoked the coals, added wood. Her movements were deliberate, practiced. She made no offer of comfort. She did not ask their names. But she made space. The fire climbed higher. The shadows pulled back. The child whimpered once, then quieted. Eleanor glanced at them only once. The man kneeling, rubbing warmth into tiny limbs. The boy's cheeks were too pale, his eyes closed too tight. She retrieved more firewood. She did not speak again. She did not need to. The cabin, long kept for one, now held 3. And somewhere beneath the ash a single ember stirred. The dawn was pale and hesitant, like a timid visitor standing in the door before stepping inside. Eleanor stirred in the bedroom alcove, the thin quilt pulled up to her chin, but her mind had already begun its day. She rose quietly and crossed the cabin floor, each step measured, as if the wood could reveal her age with each creak. In the main room, the fire had not died, thankfully, its embers glowing brighter than she remembered waking them. In the corner, Henry lay curled on a folded blanket, wearing the same damp clothes he had arrived in. The ragged innocence of him stirred something deep, a memory she had locked away. She opened a tin cupboard, pulled down an enamel pot, filled it with snow-scraped water, and set it to heat on the stove. Steam curled in the frigid morning air. She gathered flour, salt, and the last of the yeast. Kneading bread was muscle memory now. She pressed and folded the dough with quiet concentration. When the pot sputtered, she ladled hot water into a chipped mug and placed it on the table beside a thick slice of bread on a wooden plate. No words, just the silent invitation. Luke emerged from the back room carrying the child. His coat was still damp, hair shaking snow off each strand. He carried Henry with gentleness, though his movements were careful, not to rattle the boy awake. Spotting the tea and bread, he nodded once, throat tight. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse with gratitude but not hollow. He knelt beside Henry and gingerly changed the child's soaked clothes. Eleanor watched, hands tucked behind her back, as Luke fumbled with buttons and tiny socks, his brow furrowed but determined. He did not complain. He did not plead. He simply cared. Eleanor's chest felt tight. She looked away, arranging a clean blanket under the fire's light. A simple gesture, but it was a gesture. Luke finished dressing Henry and lowered him into Eleanor's outstretched arms. She carried the child to the small rug by the hearth and seated herself, the boy's warmth spreading through her like an intrusion she had not expected. He blinked up at her with big blue eyes and then settled his cheek against her chest, his breathing slowing. Eleanor caught Luke's gaze, a silent thank you passing between them, unspoken and fragile. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "What's his name?" Her tone was neutral, yet beneath it lay a wave of cautious curiosity. Luke looked at Eleanor, surprised at the question but relieved there was speech again. He stepped forward and responded softly, "Henry." Eleanor nodded once, slowly. "He looks a lot like your wife did," she added, her voice lower, an admission not meant to wound but to connect. Henry's eyes flicked between them, still sleepy, exploring the new world he had been swept into. Luke's throat tightened. She called him Will, but I switched it. Wanted something fresh. So she renamed him Henry just before his voice caught and he swallowed hard. Before she passed. Henry James. After her grandfather. Eleanor blinked, shocked at the sudden intimacy. She placed Henry into his father's arms and stepped back, clearing a space between them. "He'll be warmer here," she stated, more to herself than to him. She folded the blanket and draped it over Henry again, smoothing the wool absent-mindedly. The room fell into quiet routine. Eleanor returned to the oven, adjusting the flame, and Luke washed the tin mug. He filled it again, this time for Eleanor, and set it gently before her, meeting her eyes briefly. She offered a faint nod. There were no pleasantries. No talk of the snow or the journey. Instead, they shared space, careful, respectful, aware of boundaries. Eleanor wanted to ask where Luke came from, what his plans were, but she held back. She asked instead, "Where did you intend to go after tonight?" Luke paused, then shook his head. "I didn't think past tonight. I had my dead wife's scarf wrapped around him. I thought she would have liked that." He lifted the faded cloth with a finger, tied loosely around Henry's neck. The scarf's pale embroidery of night stars had frayed edges, but underneath it the boy's warmth pulsed with life. Eleanor's throat tightened. She looked at Henry, sucking on his thumb, eyes half-lidded. He reminded her so much of her daughter, same dimpled chin, same dusting of hair across his forehead. Pain scratched at the base of her spine. But she kept her voice steady. "Stay today," she said. "I will bake you something proper to eat." Her words were not an invitation, they were instruction, tempered with caution. A shift passed through Luke, relief mixed with gratitude. He nodded once and returned to the hearth, feeding the fire, so that Henry's bed stayed warm and bright. Eleanor stirred the dough she'd set aside, and as she pulled it from the rising basket, she realized the scent of yeast made the cabin feel fuller than it had in years. She pressed the dough and watched him knead. Henry stirred. The warmth of the room pressed against her ribs. And though she did not allow herself to hope, something flickered in the corners of her heart, the faint glimmer of belonging, an ember she had not known she needed. The cabin no longer felt like a shell. It felt inhabited, remote possible. The wind had not let up. It howled softly against the eaves, a distant animal groaning through the trees. Inside, the fire hissed low, casting long shadows on the floor. Eleanor sat in her chair, knitting by habit rather than need. Her fingers moved with the rhythm of someone trying to keep quiet the parts of herself that stirred when silence became too thick. Luke was sitting on the far side, rocking Henry gently. The boy had been restless since the late afternoon, flushed and fretful. His small limbs jerked in his sleep, his skin warm to the touch. Luke had tried everything he knew, cool water dabbed with cloth, adjusting the fire, unwrapping and rewrapping the scarf with trembling hands. But the child whimpered still, his breath shallow and quick. "I think he's fevering," Luke said quietly, half to himself. He gets like this, when the wind's too cold. Eleanor stood slowly, setting down her needles. She moved with a calm that came not from certainty, but from having once walked this path before. Without asking, she reached for the child. Luke hesitated, then let go. She cradled Henry against her chest, his tiny body scorching through the layers of wool. She pressed her cheek to his damp curls and began to sway, gently, one foot over the other. Then she began to hum. It was not loud, it was barely more than breath, but the sound filled the space like sunlight filtered through lace, thin, tender, and aching with memory. Her voice broke once on the first verse, but she kept singing. Hush, little sparrow, close your wings. The night will pass without sharp things. Mama's arms are strong and wide. Keep you safe till morning tide. Luke did not move. He watched her, his mouth parting slightly in astonishment, not because she sang, but because of the way she held his son, as if she had been waiting her whole life to feel the weight of a child again and did not know it until this moment. Eleanor looked down at the boy and whispered, "He's burning up." Luke knelt beside her. His voice came low. "He gets these when it storms too long. His mama used to." He stopped, closing his mouth before the rest could slip out. There were things a man could say, but sometimes not to a woman like this, not when she was singing with ghosts in her throat. Eleanor did not ask. She only brushed the hair back from Henry's forehead and kept rocking. The song continued, softer now, as if meant more for her than the child. No winds shall steal your dreams away. The dark won't win, it cannot stay. Sleep, my heart, so small and dear. Mama's voice is always near. Luke reached up, barely touching the hem of the shawl on her shoulder. That song, he murmured. Did you write it? No, she answered, still swaying. My mother sang it. I sang it for my daughter, once. Her voice caught on that last word, and for a moment she stood still. Henry stirred in her arms, a low whimper, then settled again. Eleanor bent, laying him gently beside the hearth, folding an extra cloth beneath his head. She lingered a moment, smoothing the lines of his brow, her hand slow and reverent. Then she tucked the scarf tighter around his neck and stood. Luke rolled beside her, watching her closely. You didn't have to. Eleanor looked at him. Her eyes were dark, unguarded, full of things she would never speak aloud. He needed warmth, she said simply, and someone who remembers how to give it. She turned back to the fire, lifting another log onto the flames. Luke said nothing. He only sat back down, one eye on the child, the other on the woman who had just let a piece of her soul be seen. Later that night, Eleanor did not return to her bed. She lay on the floor, just a few feet from where Henry slept, her back against the wall, eyes open to the ceiling. The lullaby still echoed faintly in her head, each line a thread pulling her further from the silence she had wrapped around herself for so long. Outside, the storm blew on. But inside, for the first time in years, there was breath and warmth, and the sound of more than one heart beating through the dark. The cold had not loosened its grip. Even as the sun climbed higher, it offered no warmth. Inside, the fire struggled to hold its glow, and Eleanor moved with practiced hands, stoking the embers, adding kindling, coaxing life from dying heat. Luke sat at the table with Henry in his lap, the boy curled against his chest like a bundled secret. There was quiet between them, not the silence of strangers, but the kind that forms when pain has been seen and respected. Eleanor did not ask questions. She never did. But this morning, as she moved to lift the kettle and pour water into the dented tin cups, Luke spoke. She died giving birth. His voice was low, matter-of-fact, not raw, not dramatic, just worn. Eleanor did not turn. She stirred dried herbs into the water, mint and yarrow, then slid one cup across the table without a word. Luke took it, nodded his thanks, then continued. We had a plan. Virginia to Montana. Start over, breathe new air. She packed the scarf herself. He gestured toward the cloth Henry always wore around his neck, soft blue, speckled with stitched silver. Said she stars into it, he said, looking not at Eleanor but at the wood grain on the table. Said she wanted him to sleep under the sky, even when we could not afford a roof. Eleanor paused mid-step. She was good with her hands, he added quietly. Better than me. Could fix a boot with nothing but thread and grace. Eleanor did not answer, but her face softened, just slightly. The firelight caught in her eyes, showing more than she allowed in words. Henry had finished his tea. The boy crawled down from Luke's lap, wobbling on unsteady feet, and made his way across the room. Eleanor bent to pick up a pot, not noticing the child until he reached her and tugged lightly at her skirt. She froze. The touch was light, innocent, but it hit her like thunder. She looked down and saw his fingers curled into the fabric, his eyes wide and expectant. For a moment she could not move. Her breath hitched in her throat. Then, slowly, she knelt down, facing him. Henry smiled, not the kind of smile meant to charm or ask, but the simple, pure joy of a child who felt safe. He reached out and placed his tiny hand on her cheek. Eleanor's heart clenched. She did not lift him. She did not speak. She only let the moment pass, like a wave over a scar, too old to bleed, too deep to forget. That night, the wind returned. Eleanor sat by the fire again, alone. Luke had carried Henry to the cot and was humming softly to him in the next room. She could hear the notes drift through the wall, low, soothing, incomplete. He stared into the flames, letting her fingers hover near the heat. The lines in her face caught the flicker of light, and her shoulders curled forward, as if bracing for something she could not name. A sound came, soft at first, a whimper, a breath, and a word. It was Henry's voice. She stiffened, spine straightening like a struck match. The word was faint, spoken in a dream, but it found its mark. Eleanor stood too fast, her chair scraping the floor. She turned her back to the sound, her arms wrapping around herself as if trying to keep her own ribs from breaking. Her eyes burned. She had not cried in years. Not when her husband's letter came back unopened. Not when her daughter's fever turned fatal in a single night. Not when she buried them with her own 2 hands beneath a frozen patch of earth that spring would not touch. But now, one whispered word, not meant for her, had opened the floodgates. She covered her mouth with her hand and stepped out onto the porch. The air outside was biting, sharp enough to punish, but she welcomed it, anything to drown the fire rising in her chest. Behind her, the lullaby continued. Inside, Henry dreamed peacefully. And Eleanor, alone in the cold, let the tears fall, not because she had heard the word Mama, but because, for a moment, she had almost answered. Eleanor's world had softened to the steady rhythm of 3 heartbeats, the sonorous thump of the fire in the stove, the slow breath of a sleeping child, and the cautious pulse of a father watching over them. Yet outside, the wind carried rumors. A hunter had passed by earlier in the day, his long boots coated with mud and a grim look in his eyes. He paused just beyond the cabin's edge. "Raiders," he said in low tones, turning his hat between calloused hands. "A gang, 6 or 7. They've been seen west of the mountains. Scavengers. Don't trust any stranger. These lands have teeth now." He spat into the snow and walked on. Eleanor had heard enough. She closed the door, locking it with a decisive click. She washed her hands in steaming water and moved to the table where Luke sat, Henry cradled in his lap. "You should go," she said quietly, avoiding his eyes. "It's safer that way." Luke looked down at Henry, whose eyelids fluttered against sleep. Then he looked at Eleanor, sensing the weight behind those words. "I can't," he replied softly. "He's sick again. The fever won't rise much longer." Eleanor took a breath, trying to hold back tension. Fear had taught her caution. She nodded once, wiping a fingertip across her apron. They ate dinner in silence, Luke with Henry feeding on mashed potatoes and thin broth. Eleanor with a simple loaf, crust crisped by the flames. Every rustle beyond the walls set her nerves on edge, tormented by the idea of raiders pounding the door, demanding food, fire, maybe even lives. Night pressed on them like a closing hand. The wind shifted, rattling shutters and loosening snow from the roof's edge. Eleanor lit every lamp she possessed, casting a warm glow around the edges of the room. She kept the gun tucked beneath her apron where the barrel brushed against her thigh. Near midnight, there was a soft knock, 2 slow, deliberate taps. Eleanor stiffened. The fire's hissing seemed to cease. Luke lifted Henry off his lap and placed him in his cot before stepping slowly toward the door. Eleanor walked alongside him, carrying a lantern, heart pounding like a trapped creature. As Luke reached for the latch, Eleanor's hand went to her side. The gun trusted her touch. 2 men stood beyond the threshold, ragged, half-starved, faces masked with grime and desperation. "Water," the taller one rasped. "Cold enough to kill a man out there. We won't hurt you. Just a sip." Eleanor's jaw clenched. She lifted the lamp higher. "No," she said, voice steady. "Not tonight." Luke stepped forward, blocking the door. He kept his eyes calm but firm. They glanced at each other, Eleanor's hand tightening around the revolver, but neither moved further. After a long, heavy moment, they turned away, vanishing into the storm-swept night. Luke pulled the door closed, key sliding tight. He sank against the wood. Eleanor exhaled in a rush, stepping away. "Way," she whispered, eyes still on the closed door. Luke gestured to Henry's cot. "He's ours to protect." Eleanor trembled. She placed the gun on the table, half hidden. Her voice cracked. "I used to think I was safest alone, but maybe I was just waiting for the wrong kind of danger." He came to her side and wrapped an arm around her shoulder. She leaned into him, tears wet beneath the surface. She closed her eyes and let them fall. Outside, the wind thrashed against the cabin. Inside, broken by fear and relief, Eleanor realized that protection didn't require imprisonment. Choosing to stay, to share space with them, was her own act of courage. Shadows would come, but she would not face them alone. The days began folding into each other like slow-burning embers, subtle, warm, without announcement. Luke rose early, often before the first edge of sun colored the window panes. Eleanor heard the sound of splitting wood outside, steady and sure, the thunk of axe into log echoing through the frost-hardened trees. She never asked him to do it, he never said he would. It simply began. By the end of the week, the woodpile had doubled. The back door creaked less after he repaired the hinges, and a strip of canvas covered the leaky seam in the roof that had kept her up most stormy nights. Luke never mentioned these tasks. He just left his gloves drying near the fire and set a tin of hot water near her chair before breakfast. Eleanor noticed but said nothing. Still, she moved slower past him now, lingered longer near the fire when he was close. She had not yet allowed herself comfort, but her hands no longer trembled when she reached for the kettle. Henry was the change she hadn't expected. He followed her with bright, curious eyes, always just behind her boots, always with a crumb in hand or a song only he understood. One morning Eleanor was kneeling near a basket of dried herbs when she felt a small tug at her apron. She turned, and Henry was holding something. And Edith, she handed it a comb. It was old, carved from walnut, dulled smooth with years. She had hidden it away after the sickness, swearing never to see it again. It had once belonged to her daughter. She moved instinctively to take it from his hands. But before she could, Henry pressed it to his own cheek and smiled. Then, unprompted, he reached up and placed the comb gently against Eleanor's face, as if offering comfort back to her. She froze. For one breathless moment, Eleanor didn't feel like the woman who had locked her heart behind stone walls. She felt like someone remembered. She did not take the comb. She let it stay in his tiny grasp, and when he toddled off again, she found herself brushing tears from her cheeks, without quite knowing when they had come. Later that day, as the snow tapped lightly against the windows, Eleanor returned from the root cellar to find Luke standing near the hearth. He was holding a folded piece of cloth, running his fingers over its edges, like one might trace a memory. Without a word, He stepped forward and hung it on the nail near her chair, just above the kettle hook. It was a scarf, faded blue, stars sewn in a half circle along one edge. The thread glimmered faintly, stitched with care. "She made this," Luke said quietly, "said it was for Henry, so he could sleep under the stars, even when we had no roof." Eleanor stared at it, her throat tight. "She'd want him to have a real home," Luke added, voice low, "not just a roof." He did not look at her. He simply stepped back and stirred the fire. Eleanor stood still for a long time. The scarf moved slightly in the warm breeze of the room, like a quiet breath. Then, without speaking, she turned toward the small table, poured 3 cups of tea, one for him, one for herself, one in a tiny mug Luke had whittled for Henry. She set them down gently. It was the first time they'd drank together. The silence wasn't emptiness anymore. It was presence, shared space, the beginning of something neither of them dared name. And when Henry clapped his hands at the steam, Eleanor allowed herself a smile, not full, not free, but real. He reached for her cup and didn't let go. The snow had begun to soften, but the cold lingered in the bones of the land. With it came whispers, blown in like wind through town doors that never quite shut tight. Rumors trickled down from the mountains and reached even the lonely edges where Eleanor's cabin stood. At the trading post, someone had seen smoke from her chimney. Too much smoke. Others noted tracks in the snow, too many boots for one person. Then came the more pointed comments, passed between pews and bar stools. Eleanor Carter, the widow with the dead eyes and silent gait, had taken in a drifter, a man, and a child not her own. It did not take long before those whispers knocked on her door. It was late morning when Eleanor heard the approaching hooves. She stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron, jaw set. The snow crunched under her boots as she watched the rider dismount. It was Reverend Harlan. He nodded a stiff greeting, adjusting his scarf, eyes wary as they scanned the house. "Eleanor," he said, voice heavy with the kind of concern that often carried judgment. "There have been questions in town." She said nothing. "I know you have been through much. We all do. The Lord tests us, and I would never accuse a woman of—" "If you came to accuse," she cut in, her voice sharp as the air, "then say it plain." He hesitated. "It is not proper for a woman to live with a man who is not her kin." "Proper died with my husband," Eleanor replied, "along with half the valley." The Reverend glanced at the door, brows furrowed. "And the child?" At that moment, as if summoned by the tension, Henry appeared. He waddled through the open door, his cheeks rosy, his hands smudged with flour. His eyes brightened when he saw Eleanor. "Mama!" Ah! The word rang out clear and innocent, a declaration not learned but felt. The Reverend's mouth opened slightly, stunned. Behind the doorframe, Luke had frozen. His breath caught. He turned away, one hand pressed to his face. He said nothing. Eleanor did not flinch. She bent slowly, ran her hand through Henry's hair, smoothing the soft brown curls. Her eyes never left the Reverend. "If you came to judge," she said quietly, "judge me for surviving. But do not question what this house needs now." Reverend Harlan stood silent, his weight shifting uneasily. The wind stirred, rattling the pine needles above. After a moment, he cleared his throat. "I will pray for you," he said. Eleanor straightened. "Then pray that you learn the shape of grace." He left without another word. As the sound of hooves faded, Eleanor stepped back inside, closing the door behind her. Henry looked up at her, his small hand finding hers. She squeezed it gently. Luke stood near the fire, shoulders tense, eyes glistening with unshed emotion. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. "I did not teach him to call you that," he finally said, his voice rough. Eleanor walked to the hearth, poured warm water into a basin, then turned to face him. "I know." Luke nodded, looking down. She placed the basin on the table, began kneading dough again with steady, practiced hands. Henry climbed into the chair beside her and clumsily mimicked her movements, his fingers sticky with flour. Eleanor watched him for a long, quiet moment. Then she handed him a second lump of dough and a tiny wooden spoon. No one said a word. But the house, once cold with silence, now echoed with something new. It was not blood, but it was family. The wind was softer now. Snow melted in long silver threads along the eaves, dripping onto muddy patches where grass dared to peek through. Spring had not yet arrived, but something like hope had taken its place. Luke folded the blanket slowly, his knuckles pale as they pressed the worn wool into his satchel. Across the room, Henry napped in a patch of sun, arms flung wide, a smear of flour still clinging to his cheek. His breathing was deep, his chest rising with the rhythm of safety. Eleanor stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes fixed not on Luke's bag but on his hesitation. He moved slower than usual, checked the laces of his boots twice, his shoulders slumped with a weight that had nothing to do with what he carried. "I'll be gone before sundown," he said finally, not looking up. She didn't respond. She walked past him, reached into the drawer near the stove and pulled something wrapped in linen. She unwrapped it as she crossed the room, revealing the scarf. The one Luke's wife had sewn. The one with the tiny stars embroidered into the fabric like constellations trapped in thread. She placed it in his hands. Luke stared at it. "Don't make him forget where he found warmth," Eleanor said. Luke's fingers closed around the scarf. His throat worked once, twice, before he nodded, small, aching. "I didn't think I'd stay this long," he whispered. "I didn't think I'd want anyone to," she replied. That night he unpacked his satchel, quietly, without announcement. The next morning, Eleanor hammered a small wooden peg into the wall beside the hearth. It stood slightly apart from her own. Then she added 2 more, smaller ones. By mid-morning, 3 scarves hung there, 3 hats, 3 toothbrushes, wrapped in twine. Henry laughed as she handed him a bowl of dough and showed him how to stir. His hands made a mess, flour dancing in the air like powdered snow. Luke stood beside them, watching with a softness he did not try to hide. They ate bread warm from the oven, crust golden, steam curling like breath into the open window. The door stayed ajar that day, letting in the sound of birds, of distant thawing creaks, of life. No one asked what they were now. No one said the word family. But that evening, Eleanor walked to the threshold and looked down. 3 pairs of shoes sat neatly on the stoop. One large, one small, one worn from years alone. She did not move them. She simply stood there, hand resting on the frame, and let the door swing gently in the wind. And so, beneath a roof once held up by silence and solitude, warmth found its way home. Not through promises or names, but in shared bread, a child's laugh, and the quiet comfort of 3 pairs of shoes by the door. Eleanor never asked for love to return. Luke never planned to stay. But some hearts, once broken, do not forget the feel of firelight or the sound of someone humming in the kitchen. If this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you that even in the coldest places, love can take root again, do not let it end here. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, where every tale rides with heart, hope, and the kind of endings that make you believe again. New stories await. True hearts endure, and on this channel, love never rides alone.